Welcome to Knowledge Targeting Part 5 of 50 from TI1 Voice. This episode is called Statistical Dimensions of Organized Stalking. For the next 2 hours we set aside testimony and look instead at numbers. Published government numbers, gathered by 3 national statistical agencies that were not looking for organized stalking, did not name it, and reported figures that nonetheless describe a population none of them has ever counted. We begin with what those documents actually say. That is the claim this chapter opens with, and it is a strange one. The strongest evidence, it argues, is not the accumulated accounts of targets, not the pattern work of advocates, not even the undercover investigation we examined last time. It is a handful of dull statistical reports, compiled by agencies with no interest in the subject, which asked ordinary questions about duration and offender count and got back answers they never explained. A word first on what you are watching. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series produced by TI1 Voice. Each part takes one chapter of the subject and works through it slowly, at the pace of a reader rather than a headline. The source material is the TI1 Voice knowledge base. Books, archives, legal filings, wiki articles and declarations, assembled over years by the targeted individual community and by researchers working alongside it. Part 4, David Lawson's landmark investigation, Cause Stalking in America, took us inside the networks with a private investigator who spent 12 years observing them. That was one man's eyes. This part asks a colder question. Does anything in the official record corroborate what he described? And Part 6, the official cover-up. Why authorities deny organized stalking, will ask why the agencies that hold these numbers have never joined them together. The platform behind this series is TI1 Voice at one.witisk.org. It runs an evidence library where targets file documents, timestamps, and incident logs, a knowledge base of several thousand reference documents and wiki articles, which is where this episode's research came from, and a community wall where people compare notes. Everything cited tonight is retrievable there, in full. You do not have to take our summary of it on trust. TI1 Voice also runs TI-TV, a round-the-clock live stream at meet.witisk.org/public/TITV. Episodes of this series play there on rotation, alongside interviews and archive material. Every part also carries a written companion article with the full source list, the page references, and the figures quoted here. So anyone who wants to check a number against the original report can do exactly that. A word on method, because method is the whole subject tonight. Each episode starts from a chapter of the series text. That chapter is then searched against the TI1 Voice knowledge base using retrieval, which pulls the passages most relevant to each section. Books, wiki entries, reports. Those passages supplement the chapter. They never set the topic. Where retrieval returned nothing solid, we say so rather than filling the silence. For rules govern everything said here. First, documented fact and contested claim are kept apart, and you will hear the difference named out loud. Second, quotes are kept short and the source is named in the same breath. Third, no private individual is ever named as a perpetrator. Fourth, when the evidence runs out, we say that the evidence runs out. Tonight, the fourth rule gets more used than usual. One more thing before the numbers, and it matters. If you are watching this as a target, nothing in the next 2 hours is a diagnosis, a confirmation, or a denial of what is happening to you. Statistics describe populations. They say nothing about any single person. What they can do is answer a different question, namely whether the pattern you describe appears anywhere in the official record at all. It does. Here is the shape of the episode. 3 datasets, 3 countries spread across most of a decade. The United Kingdom Home Office estimate from 2001. Statistics Canada's criminal harassment count for 2006. And the American Bureau of Justice Statistics Special Report, catalog number NCJ 224527, published January 2009. then White's arithmetic, the underreporting problem, and finally what these numbers cannot do. So, the prologue. Its argument is unusual enough to state plainly before we test it. The chapter claims that the most powerful evidence for organized stalking was produced by agencies that had no intention of measuring it and no awareness that they were doing so. They asked well-tested, mundane survey questions: how long did it last, how many people were involved, and the answers described a population those agencies have never named. The three sources are genuinely independent of one another. A household victimization survey in the United States, administered by trained Census Bureau interviewers. A police-recorded incident count in Canada, which is a completely different kind of measurement. And a prevalence estimate in the United Kingdom produced by Home Office researchers. Different methods, different legal definitions, different years. No agency was consulting another. That independence is the reason their convergence carries any weight at all. Take them one at a time, briefly, because later segments open each one properly. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report is the analytically richest, a nationally representative survey that asked about duration and about how many people were involved. Statistics Canada's 2006 figures come from police files, not respondents' impressions. And the Home Office estimate supplies something neither of the others does: scale, the size of the pool everything else sits inside. Here is the finding at the center of the chapter. 13.1% of American stalking victims told the Bureau of Justice Statistics survey that 3 or more people had stalked them. 13% of Canadian criminal harassment incidents in 2006 involved more than one accused person. 2 countries, 2 methods, 1 percentage point apart. Neither agency asked about coordination. Neither used the word organized. Hold that distinction firmly. The British figure supplies the scale. In 2001, Home Office research estimated that 1.9 million people in Britain were victims of stalking or harassment at any one time. A snapshot, not a lifetime tally. That works out at roughly 1 adult in every 24. The same research found that about 45% of those victims were men, which is not the picture most people carry. This is where the discipline starts. None of the 3 agencies drew any conclusion about coordination, about conspiracy, or about covert programs. A multi-perpetrator category inside a victimization survey is not a measurement of organized stalking. It is a gap in the data that is consistent with the claim, which is a weaker and much more honest thing to say. Every figure labeled organized stalking in this episode is an inference. Which brings us to the structural absence that shapes everything else. No national crime survey in any of the 3 countries examined tonight has ever asked a respondent whether they were the target of organized stalking. That category does not exist on any official form. Neither does gang stalking, group stalking, co-stalking, or any equivalent term. And that absence is not a neutral gap in the paperwork. It is an active obstacle. These are the terms the affected community uses, and not one of them appears as a response category on a government instrument anywhere. A wiki entry in the TI One Voice knowledge base puts it from the other direction. Some say the phenomenon affects tens of thousands worldwide, though no reliable estimates exist. That is not a coincidence of wording. No reliable estimate exists in part because nobody has ever asked the question. The absence has 2 consequences, one obvious and one far more damaging. The obvious one: there is no direct count in any government dataset, so no advocate can ever say the government found this many. The subtle one is worse. Because the category was never conceived, the instruments that do exist were not built to capture it, and by their very design they may systematically undercount the thing we are trying to see. Ask a target how many people stalked them, and you have assumed they can answer. But the perpetrators are strangers, deployed from a network, performing individually deniable acts. A target may not know whether 2 incidents involved 1 person or 2, or whether an incident was hostile at all. That is not the survey designer's fault. They measured the stalking they knew about. It does mean every figure ahead is a floor. Next, the proxy method. So the box does not exist, and the instruments were never built to find it. That leaves one question. If no government survey has ever asked whether a person was targeted by a group, how does anyone put a number on it at all? Eleanor White's answer was to stop waiting for the right question and start reading the answers to the questions that were actually asked. Social scientists call that working with proxies. White's method had 3 steps, and none of them required a new survey. Take the national crime statistics that already exist. Find the handful of questions that brush against organized stalking without ever naming it. Then treat particular answer patterns as indirect indicators of it. 2 questions did most of the work. How long did the stalking last, and how many people were involved? Neither was written with organized stalking in mind. That is precisely their value. 3 answer patterns carry the whole argument. Harassment lasting 5 years or more stands in for organization. 3 or more perpetrators stands in for coordination. And a victim who cannot say how many people were involved stands in for a group too large and too diffuse to count. Each is an inference, not a measurement. Nothing in the survey data says organized. The word arrives only when White supplies it, and she says so plainly. Take duration first. Research on conventional stalking finds that a lone pursuer's campaign usually ends. He is arrested, deterred, moves away, or simply loses interest. The fixation has a half-life. A group does not. Can rotate people through, absorb setbacks, and keep going for years because no single person has to stay motivated. That is the reasoning. It is reasoning, not evidence. One unusually stubborn individual would produce exactly the same answer on the form. The second proxy is the offender count. 3 or more people harassing the same person can mean 3 unconnected fixations, but that is an improbable accident. It is more economical to assume some link between them. The knowledge base entry on stalking by proxy makes the same point from the criminological side. Distributed perpetration, where a primary stalker works through intermediaries, some of whom know what they are doing and some of whom do not. A warning about a word. 2 different meanings of proxy are in play here, and confusing them muddles the argument. A statistical proxy is a stand-in measurement. Stalking by proxy is a recognized criminological term for a single stalker who recruits helpers. White is careful about this in her guide information handling, held in the knowledge base. Organized stalking, she writes, only sort of fits that older definition, and she declines to claim more. The third proxy is the strangest. When a respondent tells an interviewer that they do not know how many people were involved, most analysts treat that as missing data. White treats it as information. If the harassment is spread across many strangers, none of whom the target knows well enough to name, then do not know is exactly the answer you would expect. It is also, honestly, the weakest of the 3 inferences. Honesty requires stating the other side of each proxy, and the chapter does. 5 years could be one extraordinarily persistent stalker. 3 or more offenders could be 3 separate people with 3 separate grudges. An unknown number could be one person the target never saw clearly. Every one of those readings survives the data. White's argument is not that any single proxy settles the matter. It is that all 3 point the same way at once. Is any of this legitimate? Yes, in principle. Researchers use proxy indicators routinely whenever direct measurement is impossible. Unreported crime, hidden populations, stigmatized behavior, phenomena too new to have a name. Nothing about the technique is exotic. What separates rigorous proxy work from wishful thinking is whether the researcher declares the assumption that links the indicator to the thing. White declares hers one by one. You are free to reject them, but you can see them. Before the numbers arrive, one more methodological point, and it cuts in the same direction. Stalking of every kind is already badly undercounted. That is not a fringe claim. It is a settled finding in the mainstream literature. Victims minimize what happened. They do not recognize that it meets a legal definition. They decline to tell an interviewer, out of embarrassment, fear of reprisal, or a settled belief that nothing can be done anyway. Now stack a second layer on top. Ordinary stalking is underdisclosed for well-documented reasons. Organized stalking adds four more of its own, and they compound. The chapter names them: manufactured deniability, institutional reframing, complexity burden, and fatigue. What finally reaches a survey table is whatever survived both layers. So the published percentages are not the phenomenon. They are the residue of it, after two separate filters have removed an unknown share. Look at what each filter does. The first four apply to any stalking victim. The last four belong to this phenomenon specifically. Manufactured deniability means the tactics are built to resemble coincidence, so the target is unsure whether it even counts as stalking. Institutional reframing means they have already been told by people they went to for help to see a psychiatrist. Chapter 6 is devoted entirely to that response. The last two filters are practical. Describing this properly means narrating years built from hundreds of individually trivial events, and no standard survey interview has room for it. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log shows what targets do instead. Catalog everything in volumes no interviewer could absorb. Then there is fatigue. Sustained targeting erodes the very faculties needed to give a coherent account, as Chapter 7 documents. One figure from outside the survey system is worth reporting carefully. In Eleanor White's Guide Information Handling, held in the knowledge base, an advocate reports that staff at the National Center for Victims of Crime estimated roughly 1 in 10 of their calls concerned group stalking, their term. That is a staff impression relayed secondhand. It is not a count, it is not published data, and it should never be quoted as one. So read every number that follows as a floor, not a ceiling. At least this many. How much higher the true figure runs is unknown and, without better instruments, unknowable, but the direction of the bias is not in doubt. With that established, we come to the single most important document in this chapter. A Bureau of Justice Statistics Special Report, catalogued as NCJ 224527. Its title is Stalking Victimization in the United States. It was published in January 2009 by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the statistical arm of the Justice Department. The knowledge base credits 4 authors: Katrina Baum, Shannon Catalano, Michael Rand, and Christina Rose. It analyses a stalking supplement bolted onto the National Crime Victimization Survey. Understanding what this report is, and what it is not, governs everything that follows. Be clear about the limits. This report does not mention organized stalking, gang stalking, or any equivalent. Its authors draw no conclusion about coordination. And the report is not itself beyond argument. The knowledge base records that criminologists and statisticians have criticized its methodology for blurring stalking into harassment, and for applying population-level estimates to a category without a tight operational definition. That criticism cuts against White's use of it too. The National Crime Victimization Survey has run continuously since 1973. It is one of the 2 instruments the Justice Department uses to measure American crime, alongside the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports. Census Bureau interviewers work a stratified, multistage cluster sample of housing units. Everyone in the household aged 12 and over is interviewed every 6 months across 3 years. Response rates, weights, and standard errors are all published alongside the data. Why attach a supplement at all? Because ordinary crime surveys are built around discrete events. A burglary on a date, an assault by an identifiable person. Stalking does not work like that. It is a course of conduct, defined by repetition. So the supplement asked about repeated unwanted contact, about fear and distress, and, decisively for this chapter, about how long the stalking lasted and how many people were involved. This is where the sampling frame earns its keep. The standard objection to organized stalking evidence is that it comes from people who already believe they are targets and who found each other online. This sample was not. They were ordinary Americans, reached at random by government interviewers asking neutral questions, with no framing around any theory of coordination. Which brings us to the answers themselves, and to the first number, how long the stalking lasted. So the sample is random, the interviewers are neutral, and nobody in it was recruited from a targeted individual forum. That is the ground we now stand on. The question is what those randomly chosen Americans actually said. The first answer worth dwelling on has nothing to do with who was following them. It has everything to do with time. How long did it last? The Bureau of Justice Statistics asked, and printed the answer plainly. The stalking supplement asked respondents how long their stalking had gone on, and the Bureau printed what came back. There is no argument attached to it, no theory, no framing. It sits in a table of response distributions like every other line. That absence matters. Nothing in the report is reaching toward the conclusion this chapter will reach. The number arrived neutrally, from people answering a neutral question. It is simply what the survey recorded. 11% of stalking victims told interviewers they had been stalked for 5 years or more. Our knowledge base restates it as 1 in 9, and adds a useful line. Duration is one of the hardest variables to dismiss. You can argue about who was doing the stalking. You can argue about what counts as a perpetrator. It is much harder to argue with a respondent's own account of how long it went on. Set against the whole, 11% is a minority, and the report says nothing more about it. The remaining 89% is simply everything else, the shorter durations the survey recorded in its other bands. That second slice is our arithmetic, not the Bureau's. What matters is the shape. A large mainstream of stalking that ends within a few years, and a stubborn tail that does not, sitting in a federal table unexplained. To turn a percentage into people you need a base. In a related publication, the Bureau estimated that about 3.4 million Americans aged 18 and over were stalking victims in a 12-month period. Our knowledge base entry on that report flags something important. The estimate covers both fear-inducing stalking and harassment without fear. It is a broad base. 11% of it comes to roughly 374,000 people. 374,000 is a city. It is larger than Cleveland, than Cincinnati, than St. Louis, and that is the comparison the chapter draws. Hold it carefully. This is not a count of organized stalking victims. It is 11% of a broad national estimate worked out by us, describing people who said only that their stalking lasted 5 years or more. The scale is real. The label is not yet earned. 5 years is long by any ordinary measure. It outlasts most contemporary American marriages. It outlasts the typical stay in a job. It spans several lease cycles, several vehicles, more than one presidential administration. These comparisons are not statistics. They are a way of feeling the length of the thing. A crime measured in months is hard enough to survive credibly. A crime measured in years is a different category of ordeal. There is a domestic version of this clock that lands harder than any of them. 5 years means the harassment was already running when a target's child started school, and was still running when that child walked into middle school. A whole stage of a childhood lived inside it. Nothing in the survey says that. It is what the number implies about a life, and the chapter is right to say it out loud. Here is where interpretation begins, so let us be explicit about it. This comparison is Eleanor White's reasoning, not a measurement. Her argument is that a single obsessed person usually stops for ordinary reasons. Arrest, deterrence, relocation, boredom, exhaustion. A campaign that runs for half a decade has to survive all of those, which means it cannot depend on any one person's motivation holding. Something that rotates people can. That is the claim. The chapter grounds that in clinical and criminological research, which it says consistently finds most lone perpetrator stalking resolving within weeks to a couple of years. Be careful here. No specific study is named in our source, so treat it as a summary of the literature rather than a citation you can hand a skeptic. If you intend to lean on it, go and find the papers first. Here the footnotes run thin. So what would sustain a campaign across 5 years? White's answer is organization. An operation that can replace participants, absorb setbacks, and keep going when any individual loses interest. Our knowledge base puts the value of this figure well. Duration is one of the hardest variables to dismiss. You can dispute a target's interpretation of an event. Disputing how many years they lived through it is a great deal harder. White's own comment on the 11% figure is one sentence long, and the verb inside it is doing careful work. She wrote that 5 years or more is very characteristic of organized stalking, which usually never stops, because the justice systems refuse to acknowledge the crime. Characteristic, not proven by, not explicable only as. She was an engineer by training, and the word is chosen the way engineers choose words. Read it the way an engineer reads a fault report. You observe a pattern. You note that it is consistent with a suspected cause. You do not announce that the suspected cause is the only one possible, because a fault report that overclaims gets thrown out. White identifies a signature and says it fits. Everything after this, the extrapolations and the population estimates, depends on whether you accept that fit. So carry 2 sentences forward, and never let them collapse into one. First, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 11% of stalking victims reported 5 years or more. That is beyond dispute. It is what the survey recorded. Second, Eleanor White interprets that duration as characteristic of organized stalking. That is a reasonable but contestable reading. Merging them is the single error most likely to get this evidence dismissed. That error is already in circulation. Our knowledge base entry on the report's author, the statistician Shannon Catalano, notes that online forums have cited figures which do not appear in the original report at all, and have quoted the 11% as evidence of long-term organized harassment while ignoring the report's own caveat, that most stalking involves individual perpetrators known to the victim. Cite that caveat yourself before someone else does. And say plainly what the survey did not do. Our knowledge base entry on the Bureau of Justice Statistics is blunt. Its data does not address organized gang stalking or directed energy weapons. It provides a baseline for stalking in the general population and nothing beyond that. So 11% is not a measurement of organized stalking. It is a gap in the data that is consistent with the claim. That distinction is the discipline. What 5 years does to a person is not in the table either. What follows is illustrative, drawn from the chapter's own description rather than from any dataset. The damage compounds. Each additional year narrows the social network, thins the financial cushion, and widens the gap between what is being lived and what a stranger, hearing the story for the first time, is able to accept. Nobody surveys that. Everybody targeted describes it. The chapter points forward to its 7th chapter for the detail, and the mechanism it names is cumulative. Sleep deprivation. Hypervigilance that never switches off. The slow erosion of relaxed, critical thinking, which is the very faculty a person needs in order to document what is happening to them credibly. This is a description of reported effects, not a diagnosis. We report what targets describe. We do not tell anyone what is happening. Isolation is the quiet multiplier here. Our knowledge base records that many targeted individuals report their harassment leading to social isolation, as friends, family, and colleagues either cannot understand the experience or begin avoiding them. Whether that isolation is engineered or simply a consequence, the arithmetic works out the same way. The people who would ordinarily buffer the damage step back, at exactly the point where the years are stacking up. So that is the first proxy. Duration 11%, 1 in 9, and an interpretation that has to be kept carefully separate from it. The same respondents answered a second question in the same survey. How many people were involved in stalking you? The Bureau published 4 categories, running from a single stalker to an unknown number. Those categories and the arithmetic White performs on them are where we go next. 5 years of stalking is a life rearranged. But duration was only half of what the Bureau of Justice Statistics recorded. The same respondents in the same survey answered a second question, a simpler one, and for our purposes a more revealing one. How many people were involved in stalking you? The answers appear as 4 bare categories with no aggregation, no interpretation, and no comment from the agency about what any of them might mean. The question sat inside a supplement to the National Crime Victimization Survey, fielded by Census Bureau interviewers. Nobody in that conversation had heard the phrase organized stalking. The interviewer worked through a standard schedule. The respondent answered about their own life. That neutrality is the whole value of the data. Whatever the numbers show, they were not produced by people looking for this pattern, nor by respondents recruited because they already believed in it. Here is the distribution as the report published it. 62.1% of victims named 1 stalker, 18.2% named 2, 13.1% named 3 or more, and 6.5% said the number was unknown. For rows in a table, the Bureau added nothing to them, combined nothing, concluded nothing. Every argument that follows is built on those 4 figures, and on nothing the government itself said about them. Start with the majority because honesty requires it. 62.1% reported a single stalker. That is the conventional picture. One fixated person, known or unknown to the victim, conducting a campaign of unwanted attention. Roughly 3 in 5 cases fit the lone stalker model, and any serious account of this data has to begin by conceding that organized stalking, if it exists at the scale claimed, is not the typical stalking case. It never was. But the same figure has a second face. If 62.1% named 1 stalker, then the remaining 37.8% did not. Nearly 2 in 5 American stalking victims fell into a category involving more than 1 person, or a number they could not pin down. That is not a fringe residue. That is a substantial minority of a nationally representative sample, and reading it carefully is the work of this section. 18.2% named 2. This is the least discussed figure in the whole table, and the most slippery. 2 people could mean 2 unconnected individuals with separate grievances against the same target. An unlikely coincidence but not an impossible one. It could mean a coordinated pair, the smallest unit a group operation can have. Or it could mean a larger group of which the target managed to identify exactly 2 members. The survey has no way to tell these apart, and neither do we. The Bureau asked how many people, not whether they knew each other. So all 3 readings of the 2 stalker category remain open on the evidence, and any writer who tells you otherwise is adding something the data does not contain. That ambiguity is worth stating plainly, because it is precisely the kind of gap that gets quietly closed when advocacy outruns the source. Now the category that does the real work. 13.1%, more than 1 in 8 American stalking victims, told a government interviewer that 3 or more people were stalking them. 3 separate individuals independently fixating on the same person, with no contact between them, is possible in principle. It is improbable enough that coordination becomes the simpler explanation. And this figure needs no interpretation at all. It is what the survey recorded. This is the number a skeptic cannot walk around. Reject every interpretive move Eleanor White makes, discount her conclusions entirely, and 13.1% still stands in a federal report unamended. White's own summary in her booklet, held in the TI One Voice knowledge base, makes the narrow version of the point. Officials deny the phenomenon while official statistics show multiple stalker cases moving through the justice system. That is a modest claim, and it holds. 6.5% gave a different answer. They did not know how many. This is the hardest category in the table and the one where interpretation gets dangerous. Unknown could describe a large, diffuse group that defeats any head count, which is exactly what organized stalking would look like from inside. Unknown could equally describe one stalker never clearly identified, or a respondent who simply declined to answer. The Bureau drew no conclusion either way. Here is the sentence on which the whole chapter turns. White writes, adding 3 or more to number unknown gives 19.6%. The arithmetic is trivial and entirely correct. 13.1 plus 6.5 equals 19.6. Nobody disputes the addition. The entire argument sits in the decision to add those two categories together in the first place, and that decision is White's, not the Bureau's. 2 bars the government recorded, and a third that exists only because someone chose to combine them. That is the whole methodological event, and it is unusually easy to see. White shows her working in a single sentence so anyone can accept it, reject it, or substitute their own assumption and recompute. Transparency is not the same thing as correctness. But it makes correctness checkable, which is more than most claims in this field offer. Her reasoning runs like this. A lone stalker eventually slips. He is seen, photographed, named. Over months, a victim assembles a face and a number, because there is only one to assemble. A rotating cast of strangers, deployed and replaced, may never produce enough consistency for anyone to arrive at a count. On that logic, White argues, an unknown answer leans toward the many rather than the one. That is a reasonable inference and still an inference. A responsible analyst presents all 3 readings and lets you weigh them. The upper bound is White's. Fold the unknown in, and you get 19.6%. The confirmed floor sets the unknown aside as uninterpretable and keeps only 13.1. The skeptical reading distributes the unknown across the existing categories in proportion, sending most of it to the lone stalker majority and leaving the multi-stalker share in the low double digits. It is worth noticing where White actually stands among those 3. She does not take the most generous option available to her, and she does not take the most conservative. She takes the middle one, and she names her assumption in the same sentence as her result. In her own booklet's preface she writes that these are her opinions and conclusions, and that readers should be aware others may hold different opinions. Follow the chain from end to end, because every dispute about this number lives at one of its joints. A survey answer becomes a published category. 2 categories become one combined percentage. That percentage is then applied to the Bureau's own estimate of the national stalking victim population. Only the first 2 steps belong to the government. Everything after them belongs to an independent analyst working in public, from published figures that anyone can pull up. And the headline, something like 500,000 United States stalking victims may be organized stalking targets. Read the qualifiers. Something like signals approximation, maybe signals uncertainty. This is an extrapolation, not a government count. No federal agency has published a figure for organized stalking victims, because none measures the category. A separate 2010 article in the knowledge base, working from the same report, headlined 350,000. The objection deserves a hearing. The knowledge base entry on Katrina Baum, lead author of the Bureau's report, records that criminologists and statisticians have criticized this kind of extrapolation for applying population-level statistics to a phenomenon with no clear operational definition. It also notes, importantly, that the interpretations built on the report are not attributable to Baum or her co-authors. The authors measured stalking. They did not measure organization. That distinction matters. The paper trail is short and datable. The victimization survey has run continuously since 1973. The Bureau published its stalking report in January 2009. White's booklet revision of March 3, 2010, carries the arithmetic. One knowledge base entry also describes a 2010 Freedom of Information response citing over 185,000 coordinated group incidents. We have not verified that document. Treat it as unconfirmed. So here is the sentence to carry out of this section. The Bureau's data shows a real, substantial multi-stalker minority. One careful analyst's extrapolation from it lands around 500,000. Not a verified count, but a checkable estimate, and enough to establish that the population is large enough to take seriously. Whether it holds up depends on corroboration, which is why we now cross the border to Canada. There, a different method asks the same question. The American numbers gave us a floor and a wide band of uncertainty above it. Now the chapter crosses a border. Statistics Canada's count of criminal harassment for 2006 is a second national data point, and it is built in a completely different way. Not a survey of randomly sampled households, but a tally of cases that police recorded. The difference in method matters, and it cuts both ways. A victimization survey asks people what happened to them. A police-reported dataset asks a different question entirely. What did the state write down? Statistics Canada's figures come from incidents that officers logged under criminal harassment, the offense Canadian law defines. Nobody in that dataset is there because they told an interviewer a story. They are there because a report was made, taken, classified, and filed. That is a stronger kind of evidence and a much narrower one. Before a case can appear in that count, it has to survive 3 separate filters. First, a victim has to pick up the phone and report. Second, an officer has to record what they hear as criminal harassment specifically, rather than as a noise complaint or a neighbor dispute. Third, an accused person has to be identified clearly enough to be written into the file. Every one of those steps removes cases. Criminologists have a name for what those filters leave behind. They call it the dark figure of crime. The gap between offenses that actually happen and offenses that reach official statistics. The dark figure exists for every crime. It is widest where victims are reluctant to report, where authorities are reluctant to record, and where the conduct does not fit an existing offense category. Organized stalking, as this book argues, meets all 3 conditions at once. Think of the recorded count as the part of an iceberg above the waterline. What is measured is real. What is measured is also, by construction, only a portion. Nobody knows the size of the submerged part, but the direction of the error is knowable. The 3 filters only ever subtract. None of them can add a case that never happened. Whatever the true number is, it lies above the recorded one. Take the filters one at a time. The first is the victim's willingness to report. Eleanor White's book describes what she calls the standard reply. The response targets meet when they walk into a station and describe a pattern rather than an incident. A person who has already been met that way once learns quickly that a second attempt costs something and gains nothing. Cases lost at this filter never become statistics at all. The second filter sits on the other side of the counter. There is no statute anywhere in Canadian law that names organized stalking as a chargeable offense. No unit is assigned to the category. No form has a box for it. An officer facing a complaint that fits no existing box has every institutional incentive to close the interaction quickly and cheaply. That is not a conspiracy claim. It is ordinary bureaucratic behavior, and it removes cases. The third filter is the hardest. The acts that compose organized stalking are, taken singly, almost nothing. Car parked too long. A noise at the wrong hour. A remark in a queue. None of those meets the threshold for a criminal harassment report on its own. The threshold is met only by the pattern over months. Police intake systems are built to record incidents one at a time. They are not built to record patterns. That is the sentence around which this whole chapter turns. and it is worth being precise about what it does and does not say. It does not say the statistics prove organized stalking. It says the justice system is already handling cases with more than one stalker, in numbers that officials rarely mention. Whether those cases are organized stalking as White defines it is a separate question, and the data cannot settle it. The American undercount and the Canadian undercount are produced by different machinery. One is a household survey, missing people who will not describe what happened. The other is a police ledger, missing cases the system would not classify. Different mechanisms, same direction. The knowledge base preserves a softer signal to White report staff at America's National Center for Victims of Crime estimating one call in 10 concerned group stalking. An impression, not a count. So here is the Canadian count itself, stated plainly. In the 2006 reference year, Statistics Canada recorded 10,756 criminal harassment incidents. 9,327 of them involved a single accused person, about 87%, the conventional picture of stalking as a solo pursuit. That leaves 1,429 incidents, 13%, more than one accused. That is the number this section is about. 13% is, in one important sense, the cleanest number in this entire chapter. It needs no combination of categories. It rests on no assumption about what an ambiguous unknown bucket might contain. It is simply the share of recorded incidents in which police, at the time, identified and wrote down more than one accused person. There is no interpretive step between the raw data and that percentage. It is confirmed, not inferred. That distinction is worth holding on to, because most disputed statistics fail on exactly this point. Confirmed means the number came out of the file as it was written. Inferred means someone reasoned toward it. The American figures required inference, because a large unknown category sat next to the confirmed one. The Canadian figure required none. On the narrow question of methodological purity, it is the most solid single figure in the chapter. Now set that figure beside the American one. The Bureau of Justice Statistics found 13.1% of stalking victims reporting 3 or more stalkers, the confirmed floor, before anything is combined with the unknown category. Canada's confirmed multi-accused share is 13%. 2 countries, 2 methods, 2 legal definitions, 2 different years. And the hardest, least assumption-dependent slice of each dataset lands within a single percentage point. This is the chapter's strongest single result. The 2 agencies were not consulting each other, and neither instrument was designed to detect group harassment. The convergence is what you would expect if both systems, with their different biases, were catching the same underlying thing. The knowledge base adds a British reading. Home Office Research Study 210, 1998 data, found 79% of incidents had one perpetrator. White notes those were harassment offenses, not stalking specifically. 1 in 8 is how White renders 13%, and it is a fair rendering. She is careful, though, not all of those cases would strictly be organized stalking. Larger numbers also circulate in this literature. The knowledge base carries a claim that a 2010 Freedom of Information response documented over 185,000 stalking incidents involving coordinated groups. We have not seen that document. Here the evidence runs out. 2 caveats attached to the Canadian figure, and both belong in the open. The first concerns a single word. Accused is a legal designation, not a colloquial one. It means police identified a person they believed responsible and recorded that person's involvement in the file. It does not mean charges were laid. It does not mean anyone was prosecuted, and it certainly does not mean anything was proven in a courtroom. That cuts 2 ways, and it is worth being even-handed. The strength. This is a police-verified count, not a survey respondent's impression of how many people were following them. Somebody in a uniform wrote a name down. The limitation. It captures only those incidents where identification was clear enough to log a name at all. Where the harassment was diffuse, anonymous, or rotating, there is no name and therefore no record. The second caveat is sharper. The Canadian data almost certainly misses the very cases the chapter is about. Harassment by a large, well-organized, hard-to-identify group is exactly the kind least likely to survive those three filters. Victims may not be able to name anyone. Officers may hesitate to log a multi-accused file without confident identification. And the complaint may be filed instead as mischief, or a disturbance, or some miscellaneous public order matter. Which leaves 13% where the American figures left us. A floor, not a ceiling. A confirmed minimum, built only from the cases the system managed to catch and classify. How much higher the true number runs, nobody can say, and this series will not pretend otherwise. But that even the most restrictive count in the chapter still finds a multi-accused minority is the point. Next, what these datasets still cannot see. Canada gave us a floor. 13% of recorded criminal harassment incidents involved more than one accused. Now the evidence crosses the Atlantic again to Britain. The Home Office is the United Kingdom's Interior Ministry, the department responsible for policing and crime statistics. Its research yielded two findings that bear directly on this chapter. The first is a prevalence estimate of staggering scale. The second is a demographic breakdown that overturns the stereotype of who stalking victims are. In 2001, Home Office research estimated that 1.9 million people in Britain were victims of stalking or harassment at any one time. Hold on to those last four words. This is a snapshot, not a lifetime tally. It counts everyone who was living through it at the moment researchers measured. It does not count everyone who had ever lived through it. The cumulative lifetime figure would be considerably larger. The Home Office is not an advocacy group. It is the British government department that oversees policing, immigration, and public order, and it commissions research to inform policy. That matters for how we weigh the figure. Nobody at the Home Office was trying to make a case about organized stalking. They were measuring stalking and harassment broadly, for their own administrative purposes. The number arrives without an agenda attached to it, which is what makes it useful here. A prevalence snapshot and a lifetime count answer different questions. The snapshot asks how many people are dealing with this right now. It catches people at every stage. The woman whose ordeal began last week, the man who has endured it for 9 years. A lifetime count would ask how many have ever dealt with it, including those whose case has ended. The snapshot is the more conservative measure because it leaves the resolved cases out. Put the figure against the population and it stops sounding abstract. Britain in 2001 held about 59 million people, roughly 46 million of them adults. 1.9 million active victims works out at about 1 adult in every 24. Eleanor White renders the same figure differently, against the whole population, about 3 people per 100. Same number, 2 denominators. Either way, this is not a fringe experience. It is a mass one. Here is something worth noticing, and it is not a number. Stalking and harassment on this measure sit among the more common categories of victimization that British researchers count. Yet the public conversation about crime rarely reflects a problem of that size. The gap between how common the thing is and how rarely it is discussed is itself a piece of data. Part 6 of this series takes up that silence directly and asks who benefits from it. Try to hold that in your head. Nearly 2 million people in one country, at any given moment, living with someone following them, watching them, contacting them, frightening them. Enough to fill a large city. And this is the government's own estimate, published by its own researchers, not a campaigner's projection. Whatever else is contested in this field, and much of it is, the scale of ordinary stalking and harassment in Britain is not. Now the discipline this chapter demands. That figure tells us nothing whatsoever about organization, about multiple perpetrators, or about duration. It is not a measurement of organized stalking. It is a measurement of stalking and harassment broadly defined, and the organized stalking subgroup, if it exists at the size its researchers claim, sits somewhere inside it. Anyone who quotes 1.9 million as a count of organized stalking victims is misusing the number. There is a second British number, and White finds it more directly useful. Home Office Research Study 210, working from 1998 data, reported that 79% of incidents involved only one perpetrator, which means 21% involved more than one. The same study found strangers responsible in 34% of incidents. White flags the caveat herself. That study counted harassment offenses, not stalking specifically. The categories are not identical. White's reading of that study is worth stating carefully, because it is an inference and she presents it as one. 21% of harassment incidents with more than one perpetrator, and a third involving strangers rather than ex-partners. Those two features, plurality and unfamiliarity, are the signature of what she calls organized stalking. Suggestive is her word. It is not proof, and she never claims it is. It sits close to the American and Canadian findings. Scale does not prove organization, but it sets the base rate. Inside a population of nearly 2 million active victims, an organized subgroup numbering in the hundreds of thousands is a minority, not an implausibly large share. White reaches for the same logic with American figures. An ABC News estimate of 4.5 people per 100 harassed or stalked. Her own informal survey suggested about 1 per 100 reporting organized stalking. That is roughly a fifth. So much for scale. The same Home Office research carried a second finding, and it is the one Eleanor White singles out. It concerns not how many victims there are, but who they are. And it cuts directly across the picture that most people carry in their heads about stalking, a picture built by decades of news coverage, television drama, and campaign material. The number is unremarkable to read and quite hard to absorb. 45%. Roughly 45% of the stalking victims the Home Office counted were men. Not a quarter. Not a tenth. Nearly half. A 45-55 split is not a gendered crime in the way that phrase is usually meant. It describes something spread across the population far more evenly than the stereotype predicts, and therefore a victim population far more varied than the services built to help them assume. That has consequences. 2 cautions before that split is overread. First, it counts victims, not the severity or type of what they suffered. Second, other national data points the other way. The American Bureau of Justice Statistics report on stalking victimization found women at greater risk than men. Those two findings are not necessarily contradictory. Different countries, different years, different definitions, and Britain's category folded harassment in with stalking. But the tension is real and worth naming. White's comment on the figure is characteristically brief. She does not build a theory on it. She simply points at the gap between what the government measured and what the culture assumes, and lets the gap speak. It is one line in a book full of harder claims, and it happens to be among the easiest to verify, because verifying it requires nothing more than reading the Home Office's own published research. No interpretive step is needed. Be fair to the conventional picture. Male pursuer, female victim, usually an ex-partner. That image is not fabricated. Lone perpetrator stalking does fall disproportionately on women, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics found roughly 3/4 of victims knew their offender, often an intimate partner. The image is accurate about the largest single pattern. What it is not is complete. And the Home Office data demonstrates the incompleteness at national scale, using the government's own count. The chapter gives 3 reasons this matters, and they are each worth taking in order. 1. How support services are built. 2. What it implies about who ends up in the organized stalking community. 3. How hard the finding is to argue with. The third is the quietest of the three and, for the purposes of this series, probably the most important. We will take them one at a time briefly. Anti-stalking services were built, for understandable historical reasons, largely around female victims of ex-partner stalking. If nearly half of all victims are men, a very large group may be poorly served by the infrastructure that exists to help them. Men may not recognize what is happening to them as stalking. They may not ask for help. And when they do ask, they may not find anything shaped for them. That is the chapter's argument, not a measured finding. Reason 2. The organized stalking community, as documented across 20 years of forums and advocacy networks, contains a great many male targets. If organized stalking were simply a subset of ex-partner stalking, that would be puzzling. Against a gender-balanced victim base, it is not. Reason 3 and the strongest. This is the government's own published figure. A skeptic cannot dismiss it as an advocate's spin, because no advocate produced it. It is simply what the research says. That completes the third dataset. The United States gave us a survey. Canada gave us a police count. Britain gives us scale and a gender split. 3 agencies, 3 methods, 3 purposes, none of them consulting the others. What happens when you set the 3 side by side, and what you are not allowed to do with them, is the subject of the next section, because the convergence is the strongest thing this chapter has. We have now walked through each dataset on its own terms. Step back from them, and something more interesting appears than any single figure. 3 national statistical agencies in 3 different countries, collecting data for 3 different purposes, using 3 different methods across most of a decade, each found a multi-perpetrator minority in the low double digits. That convergence is the strongest evidence in this chapter, and it deserves examining slowly. Convergence matters because it is hard to fake. A single number can be an artifact of question wording, or of who happened to answer. 3 numbers, produced by agencies not talking to each other and not looking for organized stalking at all, are harder to explain away. The knowledge base puts it sharply. A belief peculiar to one culture should not show up in another country's crime statistics. None of them set out to measure this. The American figure comes from a nationally representative household victimization survey, a supplement to the National Crime Victimization Survey. The Canadian figure comes from police-recorded criminal harassment incidents, compiled by Statistics Canada. The British figure comes from a Home Office research estimate of how many people are being stalked at any one time. Survey, police record, prevalence estimate. 3 instruments pointed at the same landscape from 3 quite different angles. Start with the American floor. 13.1% of stalking victims in the survey supplement reported 3 or more stalkers. That is not an estimate or an extrapolation. It is a published figure from the United States Department of Justice. What it does not say is whether those 3 or more people knew one another. The survey never asked. Multiplicity is measured. Coordination is not. Hold that distinction firmly. Eleanor White's upper bound is 19.6%, and it is important to be clear about where that number comes from. It combines the 13.1% with respondents who could not say how many stalkers they had. That combination is White's judgment, not the government's. The unknown number category is genuinely ambiguous. Treat 13.1 as the confirmed floor, and 19.6 as an analyst's ceiling. The American dataset has real strengths. It draws on a probability sample of households, so respondents were not self-selected for any belief about being targeted. The question wording is standardized and neutral. Nobody in that sample was recruited from an organized stalking forum. These weaknesses are equally real. There is no question about organization, and the Department of Justice never published a cross-tabulation of offender count against duration, which is precisely the table this field needs. 2 further figures from the same Justice Department report. 11% of victims said they had been stalked for 5 years or more, about 1 in 9. Roughly 46% experienced at least one unwanted contact per week. The report estimated 3.4 million adults stalked in a 12-month period. The knowledge base notes an extrapolation of perhaps 500,000 Americans reporting experiences that do not fit the Lone Stalker template. Now Canada, and here the picture is cleaner. Statistics Canada's 2006 data on criminal harassment covered nearly 11,000 police-reported incidents. 13% of them involved more than one accused person. No ambiguous category to interpret, no respondent impression to weigh. These are incidents a police service recorded, with more than one named suspect. Of the 3 datasets in this chapter, this is the single cleanest figure available. Percentages float free of reality, so convert it. 13% of nearly 11,000 incidents is 1,429 multi-accused criminal harassment incidents, recorded by Canadian police, in a single year. That is a countable, documentable number attached to real case files. It is not a survey estimate and not an extrapolation. Whatever else is disputed about organized stalking, those files exist and were opened by officers. The Canadian figure has its own blind spots, and they matter. Police data only counts what reaches the police. Criminologists call the rest the dark figure of crime. If multiplicity is itself the reason a complaint sounds unbelievable, then the very cases this chapter is about are the ones least likely to be recorded. And in these statistics, an accused person is a police identification, not a court finding. Guilt is a separate question. Across the Atlantic, the Home Office estimated 1.9 million active stalking victims in the United Kingdom at any one time. That is a snapshot, not an annual total. A photograph of how many people are living inside the experience right now. It sets the scale of the base population. Whatever proportion of stalking is multi-perpetrator, it is a proportion of something very large. The subgroup sits inside that number. The same British research found that roughly 45% of stalking victims are male. That is the agency's own finding, not anyone's interpretation of it. It matters because the popular model of stalking is a crime against a woman by a lone man who knows her. A crime that approaches gender parity in the aggregate may contain a large category the conventional model simply does not describe. The knowledge base makes exactly that point. What the British estimate cannot do is measure organization. It does not count offenders per case, and it does not distinguish types of stalking. Eleanor White points to an older source, Home Office Research Study 210, using 1998 data. 79% of incidents involved only one perpetrator, and strangers were responsible in 34%. White notes those were harassment offenses, not specifically stalking. Her reading, the other 21% involved more than one. A warning label belongs on any chart that places these 3 datasets side by side, and this presentation is such a chart. They are not measuring the same thing. The British figure is a total count of people, the broadest category available. The Canadian figure counts police-recorded incidents with more than one accused, a far narrower category. The American upper bound is an analyst's estimate built on government data. It is the least comparable of the 3. Think of 3 measuring vessels of different sizes, each calibrated for a different liquid. People, incidents, and an estimate are not convertible units. The 3 figures also come from 3 different years spread across most of a decade: 2001, 2006, and 2009. They sit in 3 legal systems with 3 statutory definitions of stalking and harassment. Read them as a scale comparison, nothing more than that. That is Eleanor White, writing in her Guide Information Handling, held in the knowledge base. It is a fair claim about the figures themselves. The Justice Department and Statistics Canada published them, and no one disputes the arithmetic. It is a weaker claim about what they mean. The numbers are not debatable. Their interpretation very much is, and this chapter is careful to keep the 2 apart. That discipline is the whole point. There is an obvious temptation here, and the chapter refuses it. Add the three numbers together and you get a headline: millions of organized stalking victims worldwide. It would travel well. It would also be wrong because the three figures count different things in different years under different laws. Precision is what makes evidence durable, and durability is what this field needs far more than it needs drama. The shortcut costs more than it buys. With all those cautions in place, look at what survives them. 13.1% in an American household survey. 13% in Canadian police records. 2 different countries, 2 different instruments, 2 different legal frameworks, 2 different collection years, and the results land within 1 percentage point of each other. That is not a comparison of totals. That is 2 independent measurements of the same proportion agreeing. That is the finding worth defending. Why does that matter? Because it is the test cross-national crime data must pass. If the American result were an artifact of question wording, it would not reappear at the same magnitude in another country's police reports. Artifacts do not travel between instruments. Sampling still shifts the number. A 2001 American Journal of Psychiatry study of 201 victims found only 3% reporting multiple stalkers. Be clear about the limit. The convergence establishes that multi-perpetrator stalking is a measurable, recurring feature in at least 2 countries. You cannot say whether that means formal organization, informal coordination, or both. In any other crime category, 2 independent national findings agreeing to within a point would have triggered funded research. That it has not is itself a finding, and it is where this chapter turns next. The data is not the obstacle. 2 independent national measurements, 1 percentage point apart, and still no agency has acted on them. Before we reach the methodological critiques that close this chapter, one further dimension deserves attention, because it cuts across all 3 datasets at once. The underreporting of organized stalking is not merely a passive gap in measurement. On the analysis this book develops, it is an active product of the phenomenon's own design. That distinction matters. Every statistic in this chapter rests on someone answering yes to a question. A passive gap would mean the questions simply missed them. What the chapter argues instead is stronger and harder. The tactics cataloged earlier in this series are selected precisely so that no single incident looks like a crime. If the acts are built to be deniable, then the survey answer that follows is part of the design, not an accident. Consider what the target actually has to decide. Was that the same car as yesterday, or just a similar one? Was the stranger's remark aimed at me? Was the noise through the wall deliberate? Each judgment is uncertain, and uncertainty is the point. The knowledge base notes that ordinary social reality testing, asking a friend whether something seems strange, is exactly what isolation removes. Without that check, most people conclude they are probably imagining it. Follow that uncertainty into the survey itself. Victimization questionnaires ask, in effect, whether you have been the victim of a crime. They ask about specific incidents, specific offenders, specific harms. A respondent who cannot say for certain that anything happened will answer no, honestly. Nothing is being hidden and nobody is lying. The instrument is simply built for a kind of certainty that this pattern of harassment is designed to withhold. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report at the center of this chapter, published in January 2009 as NCJ 224527, was in one respect ahead of its time. The knowledge base records that it used a behavior-based definition rather than asking victims to label themselves. That choice was designed to reduce underreporting, and it did. But it still asks about behaviors the respondent can name. Accumulated ambiguity has no behavior to name. Eleanor White wrote that sentence to explain why targets sound the way they do when they try to describe what is happening. A blizzard has no single flake worth reporting. That is precisely the reporting problem. The survey wants one incident with one offender and one harm, The target has thousands of fragments and no name for the whole. What the questionnaire captures is the fragment, and the fragment sounds trivial. The second undercount mechanism is different, and it works independently of the first. A target who has gone to police, to doctors, to elected officials, and heard some version of "there is no organized stalking, you should see a psychiatrist" has been taught something durable. Repeated often enough, that answer becomes an expectation. Reporting does not produce help. Reporting produces a diagnosis. Chapter 6 examines that institutional reply in full, and it opens the next episode. White is describing a specific consequence, not a general grievance. Once a target has been referred for psychiatric assessment, the cost of every future report rises. Say it again to a new official and the file already contains the first answer. The knowledge base's entry on Stasi notes the same structural feature in a documented case. Harassment designed so that complaining about it looked like the symptom. That is a parallel, not proof of a common origin. Put those steps in a circle and the shape becomes clear. Each turn removes one more case from the record, and the thinner record then justifies the next dismissal. This is not a measured process. No agency counts the reports that were never made. It is a mechanism, offered as an explanation for why the recorded numbers should be read as a floor. Read it as a hypothesis with a plausible mechanism behind it. Now imagine the survey interviewer telephoning that same person. A stranger working for a government agency, reading standardized questions from a script, with a fixed set of answer boxes and no time for a long story. For the target, this is a smaller version of every institutional encounter that has already failed. There is no box marked organized stalking. There is no room for the pattern. There is only the fragment. So the target does something entirely rational. They answer in the most conventional way available. They describe the incidents that fit the ordinary stalking template, and they leave out the parts that have previously been met with a psychiatric referral. The survey duly records a conventional stalking case. The organized dimension is not disbelieved by the statistician. It is never presented to them. Withheld information cannot be coded, and uncoded experience cannot be counted. Here is what makes the argument tractable. For separate factors shape these datasets, and every one of them pushes the same way. Tactical deniability, institutional pathologization, a survey instrument built for single incidents, and plain respondent fatigue all work to undercount the multi-perpetrator, long-duration minority relative to the lone stalker majority. None of them would inflate it. The direction of the bias is not in serious doubt, even though its size is. Which brings us to the question everyone asks next. If the measured numbers are floors, how far above them does the true figure sit? Twice? 10 times? This is where a great deal of advocacy writing goes wrong, and where this chapter deliberately stops. A multiplier asserted without a method is speculation wearing the clothes of precision. The direction of the bias can be argued. The magnitude on present evidence cannot. These are the three figures the chapter has established. 11% of American stalking victims reported being stalked for 5 years or more. 13.1% reported 3 or more stalkers. 13% of Canadian police recorded criminal harassment incidents involved more than one accused person. The argument of this section is narrow and specific. Treat each of those as a lower bound, not a central estimate. The true prevalence is higher than what is drawn here. How large is the undercount? No one knows. Numbers do circulate. The knowledge base entry on the Office of Justice Programs mentions a 2010 Freedom of Information response citing more than 185,000 stalking incidents said to involve coordinated groups. This chapter does not rest on that figure, because the underlying release is not in front of us. A number you cannot check is not a number you should build an argument on. The rest of this chapter turns the discipline around and points it at our own side of the argument. There are two ways to misuse these statistics: One is to underclaim, dismissing them as noise. The other is to overclaim, and overclaiming is the more common and more damaging error. So here, stated plainly, is everything the figures in this chapter do not show. The list is longer than the findings. The statistics identify no perpetrator and no orchestrator. They do not show that any particular target's experience was organized rather than the work of one determined individual. They do not establish which mechanism, a covert program, a vigilante network, a loose distributed campaign, produces the pattern. The knowledge base notes that criminologists have also faulted the underlying report for blurring stalking with harassment. Both criticisms are fair, and neither of them makes the recorded minority disappear. There is one gap that matters more than the rest. Nothing in the published data shows whether the 11% stalked for 5 years and the 13.1% with 3 or more stalkers are the same people. The Bureau of Justice Statistics never released that cross-tabulation. It is possible, though on White's model unlikely, that the two groups barely overlap. Until someone publishes the table, the overlap remains a hypothesis. A target cannot point at the Bureau of Justice Statistics report and say this proves my case. Official statistics describe populations, not particular events. They cannot do case-level work. The report shows that the category of experience exists at a measurable rate. It says nothing about whether one person's situation falls inside it. The knowledge base is equally blunt about personal incident logs, valuable for pattern finding, but with no recognized evidentiary standing in court. White's sentence is careful, and it is worth copying. She claims that the cases are in the system, not that the system has admitted why. Presenting an extrapolation as a government finding is the fastest way to lose a skeptical audience. None of these caveats weakens the statistical case. They mark its edges. Having said at length what the numbers cannot do, the chapter now turns to what they genuinely establish. Those are the limits of the data. Now turn the ledger over. Set aside everything these numbers cannot do, and something modest but genuinely solid is left standing. The statistics in this chapter do establish things, fewer things than advocates sometimes claim, and considerably more than skeptics concede. 4 of them, to be precise. Each rests on published government tables rather than on testimony. Each can be checked by anyone willing to spend an afternoon. First, this is not a null set. 3 independent national datasets, gathered by 3 different agencies using 3 different methods, each record a meaningful minority of stalking victims, reporting multiple perpetrators sustained over unusually long periods. That removes one specific objection organized stalking constantly faces, that it is a fringe belief resting on nothing an outsider would recognize as evidence. The basis exists. It sits in published tables compiled by agencies with no stake in this argument. Eleanor White put it plainly in her compilation information handling, held in the knowledge base. Her 1 case in 8 is the Bureau of Justice Statistics figure of 13.1%. Rounded, the share of American stalking victims who told interviewers that 3 or more people were involved. Notice what she does not say. She does not say 1 case in 8 is organized stalking. She says official statistics show groups stalking at that rate. Second, the scale is large enough to matter. Take the most conservative arithmetic available. Discard the unknown category entirely. Use only the confirmed 3 or more figure. Apply the most restrictive population base you can defend. You still land in the low hundreds of thousands in the United States alone. The Bureau's 11% 5-year duration finding, set against an estimated 3.4 million stalking victims, gives roughly 374,000 people. That is a population larger than several recognized victim categories which already have specialized services, research programs, and legislation built around them. Governments fund hate crime units and trafficking task forces for populations of comparable size, and they are right to. The point is not that those programs are undeserved. The point is that a population of similar size, measured by the government's own instruments, has attracted no equivalent response whatsoever. Third, convergence. The American Household Survey found 13.1% of victims naming 3 or more stalkers. The Canadian police count found 13% of criminal harassment incidents with more than one accused person, 1,429 cases out of 10,756. Different countries, different years, different legal definitions. One a survey of households, the other a tally of police files. The confirmed slices land 1/10 of a point apart. Convergence is exactly what epidemiologists and social scientists look for when deciding whether something is real or merely an artifact of how it was measured. A finding appearing in one dataset through one method may be that method's own shadow. A finding appearing in 2 datasets, 2 methods and 2 countries at the same magnitude is far harder to wave away. Neither agency knew the other was looking. Neither used the phrase organized stalking. Fourth, the numbers establish a path forward. Criminologists have faulted the Bureau's supplement for conflating stalking with harassment and for applying population-level statistics to a phenomenon that has no settled operational definition. That criticism, recorded in the knowledge base, is a fair one. It is also an argument for better instruments, not for abandoning measurement altogether. Duration and offender count are crude proxies. Crude proxies can be sharpened, extended to new datasets, and tracked across years. Which brings this chapter to a final point, one that cuts across everything before it and opens the door to the next episode. No statistical agency in any of the 3 countries examined has ever asked a direct question about organized stalking. Not the Americans, not the Canadians, not the British. That fact is itself a piece of evidence, not about whether the phenomenon exists, but about the institutional landscape it has been trying to surface into. Recall the exact shape of the gap. The Bureau supplement did ask how many people were involved. That is where 13.1% comes from. What no instrument anywhere asks is whether those people were acting together. A figure also circulates claiming a Freedom of Information response documented more than 185,000 coordinated group stalking incidents. The knowledge base carries it. This series has not verified it against any primary document. Adding a question to a national victimization survey is never a casual decision. Survey space is expensive. Every minute added to an interview raises respondent burden, raises non-response, and raises the cost of collection. The slots are contested. Academics, advocacy organizations, and other government departments all compete for the few that open each cycle. To win one, a proposal needs demonstrated need and a constituency able to state that need in the language of policy. Now apply that test. Organized stalking has no settled legal name. It has no organized constituency lobbying statisticians on its behalf. White's compilation records a report that staff at America's National Center for Victims of Crime estimated roughly 1 call in 10 concerned group stalking. That is a second-hand staff estimate, not a published statistic, but it is a demand signal all the same, and it never became a question on any form. The third handicap is the decisive one. A body of testimony systematically reframed as delusion generates no policy demand whatsoever, and that reframing is the subject of the next episode. So read the silence correctly. The absence of a question is not neutral evidence that the phenomenon is absent. It is the predictable output of a system that measures only what it has already decided to care about. Agencies are not neutral cameras pointed at reality. This produces a loop. The phenomenon is not measured because it carries no institutional recognition, and it carries no institutional recognition because it is not measured. Each side's inaction supplies the other side's justification. It is structurally identical to the loop between public and official non-belief that White identifies, examined in the next episode as the non-belief circuit. A loop shaped like that does not break from inside. Something external has to enter it. That external input can be one researcher, one advocate, or one agency willing to field a question without waiting for the recognition that would normally justify asking it. Outside government, the knowledge base records the SCORE initiative structured attack documentation interviews, scored on a 0 to 10 evidence quality scale. Self-reported, unaudited, and no substitute for a national survey. But it is a constituency assembling exactly the kind of data agencies say does not exist. What would direct measurement actually look like? For steps, all concrete, none of which requires any agency to endorse a single contested claim about mechanism, technology, or cause. They ask only that the questions asked be capable of capturing what respondents are already describing, in whatever words respondents themselves use. This is not advocacy dressed up as methodology. It is the ordinary work of statistical improvement, and the evidence gathered here amply justifies it. Step 1. Reinstate and expand the offender count question in every national victimization survey that has dropped it. The Bureau's Stalking Supplement, the source of nearly every American figure in this chapter, was a one-time addition and has never been repeated. Critics recorded in the knowledge base allege the instrument was designed to exclude group reports. That is an allegation, not a finding, and the published offender table argues against it. Step 2. Add a perception of coordination module. Did the harassment feel organized? Did the same patterns follow you between cities? Did strangers seem to know private details of your life? Such questions capture perception, not verification, and that limit has to be stated plainly. But perception data is where many crime categories begin. Stalking itself was first measured through victim perception surveys, long before anyone built a more objective instrument for it. Step 3. Cross-tabulate duration against offender count and publish the result. The Bureau's data does not publicly show what share of 5-year victims also reported multiple stalkers. That is a straightforward operation on figures already collected, and it would test White's central hypothesis directly. Step 4. Replicate the gender analysis abroad. The Home Office finding that 45% of stalking victims are men has never been systematically checked in America or Canada. Either outcome from that replication would teach us something, confirmation, or a finding peculiar to Britain. And notice that none of these 4 steps asks a statistician to believe anything at all. White's confidence in her booklet is only half right, and the difference matters. The statistics themselves cannot be argued away. What they mean can be. Keeping those two apart is what the chapter's closing synthesis now formalizes. Those 4 steps toward direct measurement describe a survey that nobody has yet fielded. So the question becomes, what can be said today with the data that already exists? Chapter 5 closes by assembling its evidence into 3 conclusions. Each rests on a different combination of the numbers. Each carries a different kind of weight. And each is stated in a form that a hostile reader can check, line by line, without taking anything on trust. The first conclusion is that multi-perpetrator stalking is real and measurable. The second is that its scale is large enough to demand a policy response. The third is the one most often skipped, and the one that protects the other 2. The phrase organized stalking is an interpretation laid over official data, not a finding any government agency has ever made. Hold all 3 together and you have the strongest case the current evidence supports. Conclusion 1 rests on convergence. The American Household Survey found that 13.1% of stalking victims reported 3 or more stalkers. Canada's police recorded count of criminal harassment for 2006 found that 13% of incidents involved more than one accused person. 2 agencies, 2 countries, 2 completely different methods, collected for different reasons, and the multi-perpetrator minority lands within a single percentage point either way. Coincidence is a hard explanation to sustain. Why does that matter so much? because a finding that appears in only one dataset can always be blamed on that dataset. Wording, sampling, a quirk of one country's law. But the Bureau of Justice Statistics sampled households and asked victims directly. Statistics Canada counted charges that police had already filed. Neither agency knew the other's numbers, and neither was looking for organized stalking. The same minority surfaced anyway. That pattern is what social scientists look for. Eleanor White put it more confidently than this chapter will. Writing in her guide Information Handling, held in the TI1 Voice knowledge base, she says the official statistics in her booklet cannot legitimately be debated. Half of that is right. The published figures themselves are not in dispute. Anyone can look them up. What can be debated and should be is what those figures are taken to mean. That distinction runs through everything that follows. Conclusion 2 is about size. Take the most grudging reading available. Throw away the 6.5% who could not say how many stalkers they had. Use only the confirmed 13.1%. Apply the tightest population base anyone offers. You still arrive at a multi-stalker population in the low hundreds of thousands of Americans. The figure is imprecise. The order of magnitude is not hundreds of thousands, not dozens, and not hundreds. The British data supplies the denominator. Home Office research published in 2001 estimated 1.9 million people in Britain were victims of stalking or harassment at any single moment, roughly one adult in every 24. That figure says nothing directly about coordination or about multiple perpetrators. What it establishes is that the pool inside which the multi-perpetrator minority sits is enormous, and that a small percentage of it is still a large number of people. Put the two together and the scale becomes policy irrelevant by any ordinary standard. Hundreds of thousands of people in one country alone reporting harassment by 3 or more perpetrators. That is not a rounding error in a national crime survey. It is a population the size of a mid-sized city, distributed thinly across a continent, invisible precisely because it never gathers in one place and never appears under one heading in any official table. Conclusion 3 is the one that keeps the other two alive. Not one of the 3 agencies used the words organized stalking. None of them drew any conclusion about coordination, conspiracy, or covert programs. They asked how long and how many, and they published the answers. Eleanor White supplied the label. This chapter has tried to do the same thing in the open. Take official data, apply a named interpretation, and call it exactly that. The 2 columns must never be allowed to blur. On one side sit findings published by statistical agencies. On the other sit inferences drawn from them by a single analyst. Defensible inferences transparently shown, but inferences all the same. When somebody says the government found 500,000 organized stalking targets, they have collapsed the 2 columns into one. A competent critic can take that claim apart in seconds and usually does. Held together, those 3 conclusions make a strong case, the strongest the present evidence base can carry. It is less dramatic than a single headline number. It is also far harder to knock down. In a field where credibility is the scarcest resource anyone has, durability matters more than drama. A claim that collapses under cross-examination costs more than a claim that was never made at all. That is the whole argument for restraint. That brings the chapter to policy. Governments routinely allocate research money, specialist police units, victim services, and public awareness campaigns to crime categories affecting far fewer people than the multi-perpetrator minority documented here. Hate crime units exist. Human trafficking task forces exist. Cyberstalking divisions exist. All are staffed, funded, and, in many jurisdictions, addressing populations in the tens of thousands, comfortably inside the range this chapter's most conservative reading produces. The threshold has been crossed elsewhere. None of this is exotic machinery. It is the ordinary apparatus a state builds when it decides a category of harm is real. And the cheapest item on that list is the last one, a question slot on a national victimization survey. Adding one costs a fraction of a task force. The Bureau of Justice Statistics stalking supplement that produced these numbers was a one-off. It has not been repeated in the 15 years since. So the statistics change the question. The useful question is not whether organized stalking exists. The current data was never designed to answer that. The useful question is this. Given that multi-perpetrator, long-duration stalking demonstrably exists and affects hundreds of thousands of people, what is the appropriate institutional response? That can be answered without settling a single contested claim about mechanism, technology, or who might be behind it. It requires only that the population be counted. And the absence of any response so far is not evidence that the population is too small to bother with. Nothing in the published figures supports that reading. It is evidence of the institutional dynamics this series turns to in Part 6. The non-belief loop, the standard reply, the missing constituency. Eleanor White records that reply in a single sentence, repeated to target after target. There is no organized stalking. You need to see a psychiatrist. Which brings the chapter to the bill. The Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 11% of stalking victims had been stalked for 5 years or more. Applied to a national stalking victim population of around 3.4 million, that 11% works out at roughly 374,000 people, at any given time, living inside a harassment campaign that has already lasted half a decade. Every step of that arithmetic is public. 5 years does specific cumulative damage. It ends careers because no employment record survives that much disruption. It fractures families because relatives run out of patience before the harassment runs out of momentum. It erodes health steadily and expensively over years rather than months. And it consumes the savings that would otherwise have paid for a move, a lawyer, or a fresh start somewhere else. None of it appears on any national ledger in any country. Here is the estimate with its assumptions showing. Take 374,000 people. Assume an average annual cost, lost wages, medical care, related expenses in the low 5 figures, which is conservative for sustained trauma-related disability. Multiply. The answer is billions of dollars a year. The population figure comes from government data. The cost per person figure does not. It is an assumption and it is labeled as one. That is where the evidence runs out. So why has nobody ever presented that bill? Because the people who would pay it are scattered across every state, and because the diagnosis attached to their complaint discourages them from aggregating. Eleanor White notes, in a paper held in the knowledge base, that targets are often kept in what she calls a barely alive condition, unable to work or only just able to hold a job. Populations like that do not file class actions. The fiscal argument sits alongside the humanitarian one, and neither requires anybody to accept a word of the contested claims in this series. Both require only that the counting resume, which raises the obvious question. What exactly should be counted? By whom and with what wording? That is the research agenda the chapter turns to next, and it is a short list. 4 steps, and not one of them asks a government to endorse anything. That is where the cost argument leaves us. A population the government's own data says is real, large, and expensive to ignore. A policy desk will answer with a fair question. What would settle it? The chapter's final section answers concretely. It sets out a research agenda drawn directly from the gaps we have spent this hour describing. 4 steps. None of them exotic, and none of them expensive by the standards of federal statistics. The 4 steps are these. Repeat the American Stalking Survey. Publish a cross-tabulation the Bureau of Justice Statistics already holds. Add a short module asking victims whether the harassment felt coordinated. And replicate the whole exercise across countries using matching questions. Not one of those steps asks a government to endorse the organized stalking hypothesis. Each asks only that a statistical agency measure something it has so far declined to measure. Start with the survey itself. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report numbered NCJ 224527 was published in January 2009. It drew on a stalking supplement attached once to the National Crime Victimization Survey. Once. That supplement has never been run again. The figures this episode leans on are now more than 15 years old, and no comparable national survey asking those same detailed questions has been fielded since. Repeating it would be informative whatever it found. If the multi-perpetrator share held steady near 13%, that stability would itself be a finding. If it grew, that would matter enormously. If it shrank, honesty requires saying so, and White's interpretation would need revising. A hypothesis worth defending is a hypothesis that can lose. The agenda proposed here is deliberately built so that the data is allowed to contradict it. Here is the distribution a second survey would remeasure. 62.1% of victims reported one stalker. 18.2% reported two. 13.1% reported three or more. 6.5% could not say how many. Those four numbers come from the Bureau's own report and from nowhere else. What none of them records is whether the stalkers knew each other. The survey never asked that. The second step costs almost nothing. The Bureau already holds the answers to both questions, from the same respondents in the same interviews. It has never published the overlap between them. How many of the 11% stalked for 5 years or more also reported 3 or more stalkers? That table has never appeared anywhere. Producing it is an afternoon's work for a statistician with the microdata, and it would test White's central claim directly. White's hypothesis is that the intersection of those two groups, long duration and many perpetrators, is where organized stalking lives. A published cross-tabulation would show whether the two travel together or barely touch. Be clear about the limits. Even a strong overlap would not demonstrate coordination. It would show that long campaigns tend to involve more people, which is consistent with the hypothesis, and equally consistent with several duller explanations. The third step is the boldest and still quite modest. Add 3 neutrally worded questions. Did you ever feel the people harassing you were working together? Did the harassment follow you when you moved or changed locations? Did strangers seem to know details about your life they could not have learned by ordinary means? No theory is embedded in that wording. No national victimization survey in any country has yet asked a single one of them. Perception questions have a respectable pedigree. The knowledge base notes that stalking itself was first measured through victim perception surveys, before anyone had built more objective instruments. Emerging crime categories usually start there, but hold the distinction firmly. Such a module would measure how many people believe they are being coordinated against. That is not the same quantity as how many are, and no survey question, however carefully worded, can ever close that gap. That distinction runs through everything White wrote about statistics. Her claim, in the knowledge-base copy of her book, is narrower than her critics tend to assume. She does not say the government counted organized stalking victims. She says the justice system is already processing cases with several stalkers, while officials deny such cases exist. That is a contradiction inside the official record, and it is checkable. Note what she stops short of asserting. The fourth step is international. The Canadian and British numbers this episode relied on are older still. The Home Office prevalence study dates from 2001. The Statistics Canada harassment count covers 2006. The American supplement was published in 2009. Since then, none of the 3 countries has repeated its stalking-specific collection at that level of detail. A coordinated multi-country effort would transform this evidence base. There is a particular reason to want the international version. The knowledge base frames it this way: if organized stalking were the product of one culture's anxieties, a fringe belief circulating in a particular online subculture, You would expect it to vary sharply across cultures and to be absent where that subculture does not exist. White states that targets in all industrialist nations describe the same tactics. That is testimony, not measurement. This is the whole point of the agenda, and it is worth saying slowly. None of these 4 steps requires any government to endorse any hypothesis. They require only that statistical agencies do the things statistical agencies exist to do. Measure what is there, whether or not it fits the categories already printed on the form, and then let the data say whatever it says. That is ordinary statistical practice. Which brings the chapter to its close, and to the hardest discipline it asks of anyone using this material. The section is called the discipline of numbers. It is not really about the numbers themselves. It is about how you carry them, how you speak about them to a skeptic, a journalist, a legislator, or a friend hearing the phrase organized stalking for the first time and deciding whether to keep listening. Compare 2 ways of saying the same thing. The short version. The government found that 500,000 Americans are organized stalking targets. The long version, the Bureau found 13.1% reporting 3 or more stalkers. White added the 6.5% who could not say how many, reaching 19.6, then applied that share to the national victim population. The first is quotable. It is also untrue. The short version dies under questioning in about 10 seconds, because the government found nothing of the kind. And the underlying report has critics of its own. The knowledge base records criminologists and statisticians faulting it for blending stalking with harassment, and for applying population-level statistics to something that has no clear operational definition. Those criticisms are not aimed at the report's authors personally. They are aimed at the method. The same discipline applies to what targets collect themselves. The knowledge base describes the 1,000-event memory log, a documentation practice built entirely outside academic and legal frameworks. Its own entry is candid. Critics say the format invites confirmation bias, because a person cataloging incidents already believes what the catalog is for. Such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, though some targets have attempted to use them in litigation. There is a subtler trap. A knowledge base corpus analysis of community submissions found identical reporting templates recurring across different people, with one attack log document scoring a similarity of 1.0 between separate users. Shared forms can look like independent corroboration when they are nothing of the kind. The response has been an evidence quality score, rating submissions from 0 to 10. That is the right instinct, provided the scoring rule is itself published for others to check. So the chapter ends where it began, on method. A claim built transparently with every inferential step laid bare is durable. It cannot be exposed later because it has already disclosed itself. The pithy version wins the argument this afternoon and loses it permanently the first time somebody checks. In a field where credibility is the scarcest resource anyone has, durability beats impact. It is not glamorous work. It lasts. That is the discipline of numbers, and it is the standard this episode has tried to hold throughout. What remains is to gather the argument in one place, what 3 national datasets actually showed, what Eleanor White made of them, and exactly where the line falls between the two. And then, just as importantly, to be plain about everything these numbers still cannot tell us. Both halves belong in the same summary. That is the discipline of numbers, and before we close, it earns one last test. The British figure has been sitting in this episode doing a job the American and Canadian figures cannot do, and it is routinely misread. So we take it apart slowly. What the Home Office measured, what it did not measure, and exactly how far a careful person is entitled to travel from it. The honesty lies in where you stop. The American and Canadian datasets answer a proportion question. Of the people being stalked, what share face more than one pursuer? The Home Office research answers a scale question instead. How many people in Britain are being stalked or harassed at all? Those are different questions, And the chapter is blunt that the distinction is often lost when the three datasets get presented side by side without adequate framing. It matters more than it sounds. Think of it as a fraction. The American and Canadian surveys give you the top of that fraction, a share in the low double digits. The British research gives you the bottom, the population that share would apply to. Neither number means much on its own. A percentage with no base is a rhetorical flourish. A base with no percentage tells you nothing about what kind of stalking those people face. Put them together carefully. In 2001, Home Office research estimated that 1.9 million people in Britain were victims of stalking or harassment at any one time. Hold that number carefully. It tells us nothing directly about how many of those 1.9 million faced more than one perpetrator. The Home Office never published the cross-tabulation that would answer it, and the published data cannot be made to answer it. That is a real limit. So what is it for? It establishes the room. If the total stalking population of a developed country is measured in millions, then even a small minority inside it is a large number of human beings. That is the whole contribution. Not a finding about organized stalking, but a finding about the size of the space in which any such minority would have to live. It is modest and it is genuinely useful. The chain has 4 links and the chapter shows every one. First, a multi-perpetrator minority measured independently in 2 countries at around 13%. Second, the modest assumption that a third country with similar legal and social structures probably has one too. Third, that share applied to a base of nearly 2 million. Fourth, and this is the link people drop, the result labeled as an estimate. Drop the fourth and the whole chain fails. The chapter writes its own honest formulation, and here it is. The estimate is inferential, not directly measured, and should be treated as an order of magnitude guide rather than a precise count. Notice how little that sentence claims. Notice also that it cannot be taken apart by a critic, because it has already conceded everything a critic could find. That is not weakness. That is armor. It is the only durable way to carry a number like this. There is a tempting shortcut here, and the chapter refuses it. You could take the American 13%, multiply it straight into the British population, and print the answer. That would be methodologically indefensible. Different statute, different counting method, different year. What survives is the weaker and more defensible claim. A minority found in 2 comparable countries is likely to exist in a third. Weaker claims last longer, and that is the trade this series makes. The chapter closes by pointing outward. The tactics episode explains why individual incidents cannot be counted. The Lawson episode explains why survey respondents struggle to name perpetrators who look like neighbors. The episode on institutional denial explains why the underreporting compounds. And Eleanor White's own standard, demonstrated and attributable, is what stops any of this becoming the overclaim that would destroy the credibility the numbers were gathered to build. Nothing here stands alone. Look at the dates because they matter. The Home Office study behind one of White's figures used 1998 data. The prevalence estimate is from 2001. Statistics Canada's count is 2006. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report, NCJ 224527, was published in 2009. Nothing comparable has been fielded since. The evidence base is not just thin. It is aging. Anyone could fix that. Here is the recap, and it is deliberately short. 3 published percentages. 13.1% of American stalking victims reported 3 or more stalkers. 13% of Canadian criminal harassment incidents involved more than one accused person. 11% of American victims had been stalked for 5 years or more. No interpretation has been added to any of those. They are what the agencies printed. A skeptic has to start here too. So the episode's case end to end. 1. Multi-perpetrator stalking is real and measurable, because two agencies using two entirely different methods found it at the same magnitude. 2. The population is large enough to matter, in the low hundreds of thousands even on the most miserly reading. 3. And this is the one that protects the other two. Organized stalking remains an interpretation, not a government finding. Hold all three or hold none. It is worth saying once more, slowly, because this is where the argument usually dies. No statistical agency in any of these three countries counted organized stalking. None of them used the phrase. What Eleanor White did was take their published tables, apply a named and checkable interpretation, and publish the result as exactly that. Say what she actually did and you are unassailable. Say she found it and a critic ends you in seconds. Now the honest column, and it is longer than anyone would like. Nobody has published whether the long-duration victims and the multi-perpetrator victims are the same people. No survey has ever asked whether the harassers seem to be working together. The undercount is real, but its size is unknown, and anyone naming a multiplier is guessing. And nothing has been replicated. Here the evidence genuinely runs out. None of that is fatal. All of it is fixable. And that brings us to the door of the next episode. The reason no agency counts this is not that somebody checked and found nothing. It is that adding a question to a national survey requires a name, a constituency, and a policy case, and this phenomenon has none of the three. So it goes unmeasured, and being unmeasured is then treated as proof it is not there. That circle has a name, and it is next. Eleanor White writes, in her guidance on handling information, that the official statistics in her booklet cannot be legitimately debated by naysayers. She is half right and the half matters. The existence of those tables is not debatable. Anyone can download them. What they mean is debatable vigorously, and this episode has spent 2 hours inside that debate rather than pretending it does not exist. That is the difference between a slogan and a case. The anchors for this hour. Chapter 5 of Knowledge Targeting. Eleanor White's booklet, Knowledge Base number 765. The Bureau of Justice Statistics Report, NCJ 224527. Statistics Canada's Criminal Harassment Figures for 2006. The Home Office Research on Stalking and Harassment. Everything else came from the TI1 Voice Knowledge Base. Every number here is checkable, and we would rather you checked. The companion article lists each one. If numbers feel like a cold way to talk about your life, here is the warm part. TI1 Voice is a platform built by targeted individuals for targeted individuals. An evidence library, a knowledge base, a community wall, secure messaging, in dozens of languages. Every structured account logged there is one more row no survey ever collected. TITV carries this series around the clock. Both are free to join and free to leave. Next time, Part 6, the official cover-up. Why authorities deny organized stalking. This episode showed you data sitting in plain sight in government publications. The obvious question is why no institution will pick it up. Part 6 goes after the machinery of that refusal. The standard reply at the front desk, the mental health trap behind it, and the loop that keeps the question off every survey form. Denial, it turns out, has a structure. Thank you for giving 2 hours to percentages and caveats. It is not the dramatic version of this story, and that was the point. If you take one thing from this episode, take the habit. Say what was measured, say who measured it, say where your own reasoning starts. Numbers held that way survive. Look after yourself tonight. Rest if you can. You have earned it. We will see you in Part 6.